Good morning everybody on this very rainy day, and let me introduce you to whom I like to call the Green Plate Club. That's right, it's the three big luxury EVs on sale in India: the Mercedes-Benz EQC, the Jaguar I-Pace and the Audi e-tron, which we have today in Sportback, guys. Now, I brought the three of them together. We've managed to get them after a very long time of trying, but here they are, and we are, as always, going to tell you which one is the best to drive, which one is the best to be driven in, comfort, luxury, tech, all that. But because they're EVs, there's another element to it. We want to tell you all about range and what it's like to drive an EV in the real world. Come, let's go for a drive. Before we get moving though, just a quick reminder to like and share this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Autocar India. We're on the very edge of 2 million subscribers, and you could be the one to take us there. Click on that bell to stay notified, and if you have a favorite of these three luxury ESUVs, put it in the comments below and I'll see you down there to chat about it. Now we have a long journey ahead of us, so I think it's best we get this show on the road. So I think it's fitting that we start this experience in the one that started it for luxury EVs here in India. It's the Mercedes-Benz EQC. Now, as you might have noticed, there's another camera here. I do apologize. That's going to be there in all three of the cars, and that's because we are using it to keep an eye on the range and the vehicle consumption throughout our drive. So bear with that, please. In order to best analyze the range, we set up all three EVs to be at their most efficient. So what you need to know is that we have all three cars in their eco setting. We have all the air conditioners set to an even 22 degrees centigrade. And we also have every car's regen setting set to its maximum. However, in max regen mode, especially in heavy traffic like this, you have to adjust your driving to suit. You're not hitting the brake consciously, but the car is decelerating very, very fast. So you have to make enough room for the car behind and make sure they have enough room to stop. Now, one thing I'm thankful for here in the EQC is the fact that it has an inbuilt creep function. Now, EVs don't necessarily have that or need that. It's something that has to be engineered into them just because of the nature of how EVs work and electric motors work. And they've done that with the EQC, and it helps it feel a lot more usable and a lot more like a traditional automatic car. It really does feel like a regular Mercedes GLC from behind the wheel, and that's because under the skin, that's what it is. The EQC's GLC origins are pretty plain to see from the driver's seat. It's about the same size, you get the same view out, and it gives you that same corseting luxury experience. But of course, there are very many EQ touches all over the cabin. For instance, these bronze looking elements in the AC vents, they're really, really nice, and I like the way the dashboard is a little bit slopier than the standard GLC. It just looks that little bit more special, and if you're splurging on an EV, that's kind of what you want, isn't it? The EQC cabin then is classic luxury, but the tech is very futuristic. Now, with things like power consumption and state of charge being new concepts for a lot of drivers, especially here in India, it's always important for an EV to present that information in a nice, digestible manner that's easy to understand and easy to read while you're on the move. There are two displays on that screen that I find very useful in the EQC. The first one is the energy flow meter, which literally shows a graphic of the car and the two motors and the battery and exactly where the power is coming or going from. The other screen I'm quite interested in is consumption, which basically shows a graph over time about how much power you've consumed and how much regen you've done in your time driving. There's also something that has to be said about the sound or lack thereof that comes out of an EV. Now, some car makers prefer to provide an artificial sound so that you know what's going on and how you're accelerating. But Mercedes, by the sounds of it, has chosen not to do that. It is all but silent in here. You don't get that whir, that whine. And this greater sense of quiet gels well with Mercedes' luxury-first approach with the EQC. Now, I'm actually enjoying the relatively compact dimensions of the EQC here in the confines of Mumbai city. However, and this is a big one, you have to be extremely careful in the EQC crossing over speed bumps, because although this is an SUV, its ground clearance isn't as much as you'd think. You see the big battery pack that sits under the car floor lowers the ground clearance quite a bit compared to what it looks like from the outside. And it is very easy to scrape this car's belly or its battery pack on speed breakers, even ones that aren't all that large.
And with that, we start to leave Mumbai city limits, but just before we do, it's time for our first driver change, and into the Audi e-tron I go.
Getting into the Audi e-tron after the EQC, there's an immediate change in scale. This car certainly feels a whole size up from the EQC. But that's not to say it feels too large. It wraps around you really nicely in this cabin. I like the way things are slightly angled towards the driver. And I also like how bright the screens are. Still not a fan of the lower AC controls, but once you set it, set and forget, and don't have to look back at it ever again.
Comfy in my new seat for the next leg, it's time to set off.
The other thing you notice immediately in the e-tron is that there is no creep function, and from a standstill you have to step on the pedal to get things moving. It does take a bit of a firm prod, but it comes on smoothly. It doesn't lurch you forward. As with the Mercedes, you can control the amount of regen you want by pulling on the paddles over here, and that's very, very handy because sometimes you might not want so much regen. This one has far gentler deceleration in terms of how it feels when you're driving. It takes not too much to get used to, and that's a good thing indeed.
Now, I mentioned the EQC was very silent earlier. In the e-tron, however, there's something else.
Just spending a bit more time now in traffic with the e-tron, and it too is quite silent. Of course it would be, it's an EV, but what they've done, Audi, is put a little bit of sound into the mix. They've injected some sci-fi noise. Kind of sounds like George Jetson's car, if you remember what that sounds like. And that's kind of cool. It prepares you for the new experience of driving an EV. And also in the meantime, it makes you aware of how much you're accelerating or decelerating, which is important in an otherwise silent environment.
What you also need to be aware of is how efficiently you're consuming electricity. And well,
one thing I'm not such a big fan of in the Audi is the fact that there's very little by way of telling you your state of charge or power consumption. The display over there is very basic. It simply shows your state of charge and not much else. So if you're trying to keep an eye on efficiency, it's not the handiest. It's a bit too simple, and I'd have liked a little bit more data while you're driving.
that's a shame because the rest of the e-tron feels very techy.
The cabin ambience in the e-tron is a little bit sci-fi, and I like that, but it is also very similar to any other Audi SUV. They kind of wanted that when they designed the e-tron. They wanted it to feel conventional, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. The good bit is that you know where everything is. It's all very logically laid out, and especially if you've had an Audi before this, you'll know exactly what to expect and how to use this the moment you step in. However, some people might have liked a little bit more drama, a little bit more sense of occasion from their EV cabin. The steering isn't quite as light as the one in the EQC, but that's actually okay. The EQC felt a bit overtly light, you'd really notice it. This one isn't too bad, and I quite like the amount of weight they've added to it. Just feels a little bit more reassuring because this is a big car. You don't want it to be too light either.
An important thing to note is the suspension setups of these three cars. The Mercedes has steel springs and passive dampers. The Jaguar we are testing today also has a similar setup, but you can add air suspension and adaptive dampers as an option. And the Audi has air suspension with adaptive dampers as standard. And this makes a difference.
This air suspension really has done wonders, and although it rides on 20-inch wheels, what you do also have to realize is that it's got a very high profile tire, 50 profile in fact, so there is a lot of rubber between the rim and the road. So between that and the air suspension, the e-tron really soaks up some of the worst bumps a monsoon ravaged Mumbai can throw at us, and that's really saying something. It feels like a Q7 or a Q8 really out on the highway. It's got that big car feel, that comfortable cruising ability, and yes, a little bit of floatiness on the air suspension, but that's just fine. And of course, this being an EV with a strong reserve of power just waiting to be unleashed, yes, anytime you want to make an overtaking maneuver, it's just a flex of your right toe away.
Just as I'd gotten really comfy in the big Audi, it was time for another driver change. Time to hop into the low-slung Jaguar I-Pace.
Now I've just stepped into the Jaguar I-Pace and immediately it is the sporty one. There's no getting around it. Just the way you sit. Yes, I've had to jack my seat up pretty high because I'm quite short, but still this feels like the whole car is just built around me, cocooned around me. It's like a glove. It's snug, it's tight, and it feels sporty. It's just a wonderful driving environment. It makes you want to go fast even though you're sitting still like I am right now. But although this car has a wild sci-fi looking interior, there is one thing that has to be said, and that's that the quality doesn't quite match up to the other two. You'll still find a few poor plastics, rather basic looking window switches for example, and even the leather stitching and stuff isn't quite up to scratch yet. But hey, for its slight lacking in quality, it more than makes up for it with a crazy sense of occasion. Now there is another interesting thing about the Jaguar I-Pace. It has synthesized sound. It's kind of bizarre that it sounds like an engine but it goes like an EV. It's a cool feature, but I don't think I'm particularly a fan. I'd probably switch it off if possible. But that just goes to show that's what Jaguar is after. They want you to feel like you're in the sportiest car because it is the sportiest car of the three by far. The EQC does have the stronger throttle response even in eco mode. The Jags is actually very progressive, in fact the most progressive of the lot. What that means is it's not so sensitive to pressure but more sensitive to the amount of throttle travel. So if you want to go gently, you extend your foot this much. If you want to go faster, you extend your foot that much, and so on and so forth. It's actually a more natural feeling thing, where the other two try to simulate the effect of a gearbox and kickdowns. This one doesn't bother with anything like that.
This also translates to the quickest acceleration of this trio in our Autocar performance tests, where the I-Pace got to 100 kph in a scant 4.97 seconds. The Mercedes meanwhile did it in 5.5 seconds and the Audi in 5.8. Weight, however, is also a factor here, as the all-aluminium Jaguar weighs in at 2.2 tons, which is around 300 kilos lighter than the Merc and 400 kilos lighter than the Audi. So the Jaguar clearly has an edge on performance, but it does make a compromise when it comes to ride quality.
Another thing that's a bit unfortunate is this car's ride on these steel springs. The air-sprung car we drove earlier rode really well, but as we mentioned earlier, air springs are an option on the Jaguar I-Pace. They're not standard and they don't even come in any of the higher trims. You have to pay for it separately. Well, it's something we do recommend spending on because it really does wonders to improve the ride quality of this car. On the steel springs, it simply feels a little too stiff, and you'll feel a lot of movements as you go over an undulating surface or through sharper bumps. It's not ideal and not the sort of cosseting feel you expect from a luxury car of this price range.
Next up on our route of various driving conditions comes an interesting one. A hill section.
Now we've gotten off the sort of flattish highway and we're doing a bit of an ascent up a hill road, and ascents are the enemy of the EV. You see, when you think about the way an EV consumes its power, if it needs more effort, it takes more power. There's no gears or any such variable factor there. It's as simple as if it needs more effort to climb, it will need that much more power to do so. But as we are doing this hill climb section, I'm glad to be in the Jaguar, the sportiest one of them all. So let's talk some numbers. In this short climb, it's only been a couple of minutes and we've already lost about 3 kilometers in range in what really has not been 3 kilometers, I'll be honest. But that's just how it is with EVs.
With the regen already set to maximum, I was all set to claw some kilometers back on the way down.
And here we are on the downhill section where I'm pretty much not using the brakes at all. I'm relying entirely on regen to pull back all that precious juice and fill it back into the battery.
However, a quick calculation on the trip and range meters told us we'd lost an average of about 20 kilometers of indicated range for just 3 kilometers of uphill driving, and that's despite recouping a few kilometers back on the downhill section. So, if your journey in an EV involves hills, plan accordingly. But enough about range for now. This is a great road, and I want to switch over to the Jag's more enjoyable side again.
And that's just the brilliance of the Jaguar. It's so easy to change its character. It also feels the tightest control on its suspension. Feels hunkered down. You always feel low to the ground even though you are in a crossover. And it just eggs you on to drive a little bit faster. There are a few corners on this highway section that I'm driving now, and it just makes you want to lean into them at whatever speed you're doing with no fuss at all. And there will be no fuss at all. This steering feels the most confidence-inspiring, the weightiest, and that's just what you want when stringing together a set of corners.
Not long after, it's one more driver swap and it's full circle and back to the EQC for me.
Now here's the fun thing about the EQC. It is the smallest car here, but it has the most torque. 765 Newton meters. That's a whole 100 Newton meters more than what you get in the Audi e-tron. That's hilarious. And it's all available from just 0 RPM. The moment you get off from 0 RPM, 100% of torque. That's crazy. Now you might think that because the EQC is the smallest car here that it is the most nimble and agile. And yes, there is some agility to be found in it, but in terms of the driving experience, it's still very much the Jag that is the most fun to drive on a curvy road, not this one. And that's because this is geared more for luxury.
The EQC may not have air springs even as an option, but it has been set up to be soft and cushy, like a Merc should be. It absorbs bumps well despite its 20-inch wheels and relatively low-profile tires, but you have to be aware of a bit of pitch and bounce as you go faster. One final driver switch before the day is done, but while we're stopped, let's quickly have a closer look at what these cars are like outside and in. Now yes, looks are subjective, but I think you'll agree all these SUVs are quite stunning in their own right. The EQC has the classic SUV proportions, updated with some cool blue EV touches. The e-tron in this Sportback, guys, is a classic Audi with a bit of coupe-like sloping roof flair. And the I-Pace? Well, it just looks like a spaceship that's come down to earth. Which is your favorite looking of the bunch? Let us know in the comments below.
These being luxury SUVs that cost more than a crore, they're all very well equipped, of course. But it's worth noting that the EQC, the most affordable car here, has all its equipment as standard, while the e-tron has a few options. The I-Pace has a lot of options, and this is despite being offered in 3 variants, so the price could quickly go up a lot higher.
And while we're here, let's have a look at the back seats.
Well, just as the EQC is the most conventionally shaped SUV on the outside, so it is the most conventional on the inside too. It is also the smallest car of the 3, and that's plainly felt back here. It is a GLC in EQ, guys, after all. You sit quite upright. Knee room is decent but not amazing, and headroom, well, that's pretty good considering it has a full-size normal high-riding roof. But there is no escaping the fact that this is a slightly smaller car, especially when you factor in the width of the thing. And the dark colors do sort of make you feel a little bit hemmed in, but I'm sure you can opt for a lighter color there. Still, it's pretty comfortable on its own in isolation, and you wouldn't mind spending a bit of time back here, especially with creature comforts like your own sun blinds and of course the Burmester hi-fi sound system. But bear in mind, the sunroof only extends to the front over there, doesn't come all the way back as it does in the other 2 cars.
In the low-slung Jaguar, things aren't quite what they seem.
Now, as you might imagine by looking at the I-Pace from the outside, it's not quite so easy to get into the back because of the high floor and low roof. It's a bit of self-origami folding that you have to do to get into place. And once you're in place, the seating position is quite unusual. The seat squab rises up like this. You're sat at a bit of an angle, but you gotta admit there is enough place back here. The glass roof actually gives you more headroom for a change rather than eating into it because they've scooped it out back here. And you'll notice that knee room is plenty and you get a decent amount of comfort, although the cushioning is a little bit firm. It's very unique, it's very cool, and there's enough to pamper you back here. Your own 2 sets of climate and lots of charging options. And it's unlike any other crossover or SUV I've ever sat in the back in. So more of the same from what you get in the front then.
But really, if you intend on being chauffeured, it has to be the Audi.
Soft closed door function, don't you just love it? Now amazingly, despite the fact that this is the Sportback version of the e-tron, it actually has the most spacious backseat of the 3 cars here, and that's simply because it is the biggest car here. There's no sandwichy constraints like you get in the I-Pace, and it's frankly just a larger car than the EQC. So you have plenty of knee room to stretch out, and surprisingly plenty of headroom too. And if you opted for the standard e-tron, you'd get even more headroom than this. It certainly feels the widest. You aren't as hemmed in as in the Jaguar, that's for sure, but you still get creature comforts like sun blinds. It's got a very large window for something with a sloping roof, and you own 2 separate zones of climate for the back. The seat itself also, it's nice and plush. It's pretty flat, so a third passenger apart from this big console would be quite comfy back here. And all in all, if you were to be chauffeured, the e-tron, whether you choose the Sportback or the standard version, is clearly the best one of the lot.
Now, while an EV might not be ideal for a long distance trip, a big boot is still important, say in case you want to do an airport run with the family. However, an EV's batteries can eat into luggage room, and to that end, both the Mercedes and the Jag offer up around 500 litres, while the Audi, even in this swoopy Sportback guise, gives you a whopping 616 litres. What's more, in the e-tron, the spare wheel is hidden beneath the boot floor, while in the other two, it eats into boot space. As the sun goes down, we arrive back at base, and now it's time to see just how well these cars did on range.
Well, here we are back at home base, the Autocar India office, and our trip has been 213, that's 213 kilometers. Now, the Audi e-tron has gone through 56% of its charge in those 213 kilometers. What about the EQC?
About 81 consumed.
It's gone through 81% of its battery charge in those 213 kilometers. And let's have a look at the Jag now. What about the Jag, Sharma?
Well, it's consumed only 47% of its battery.
There you have it. The Jag has consumed 47% of its battery in those same 213 kilometers. And that just goes to show that nothing is a straight line. It's not a direct correlation, and there are many factors at play. So we're going to crunch the numbers and tell you exactly what the range actually is in the real world.
As you can see from the graph, over the same distance in the same conditions, the Mercedes dropped the largest percentage of its charge. Now yes, it has the smallest battery here at 80 kilowatt hours, but its claimed range of 414 kilometers is not too much less than the Jag's 470 kilometers and the Audi's 484 kilometers. As per this test, its real-world range works out to about 259 kilometers, considerably lower than the Audi's 375 kilometers and the Jag's 447 kilometers, showing that the I-Pace holds on to its charge better than the others and comes closest to the WLTP rated claimed range. So, is the Jag the winner then? It's the quickest and sportiest and has the longest range. However, the heavy steering makes it cumbersome at low speeds, the firm ride on the steel springs isn't all that comfy, and a lot of the features on it are optional add-ons. The bigger reason it doesn't win, however, is that it's just not spacious and practical enough in the backseat or the boot, making it a superb EV but not a great luxury SUV. The Merc EQC isn't particularly spacious either, but then its size and price put it in a sub-segment lower than these two. It's not small on performance, features or luxury though. Mercedes has made sure of this. The bigger issues it faces are its perilously low ground clearance and its real-world range, both of which hurt its usability as an everyday car in Indian road conditions. The e-tron isn't as quick or fun as the I-Pace, and it's a whole lot more expensive than the EQC. But overall, it's the best package here. It's got very good range, it's the most spacious even in this Sportback guise, and it's comfortable and luxurious to boot. Most of all though, it's easy to drive and live with, making the shift from an ICE car to an EV that much easier. For now then, the Audi e-tron is the pick of this luxury electric SUV segment. But stay tuned, because another contender has just entered the fray.
You know what time it is, ladies and gentlemen? It's time for EV13. Let's go. Because really nipping in and out of gaps in traffic. Oh, that was not pretty. Okay, ouch. For now, to take an existing thing and make it look the part is just a great job from the designers all around. There's that George Jetson sound.